Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I'm Zachary Grant. I use they and she pronouns. I'm really proud to be the community director at the Church of the Holy Trinity and to support a team of people who run Unity Kitchen, which is a community hub and a street survival program in downtown core of Toronto. I wrote this workshop because of so much interest in the carceral system that I had received after doing many years of work for an organization called Pasan. And then afterwards, of my own volition with partners of mine who continue to do outreach in Reach and try and have creative interventions within the prison system. And so what I realize is that prison is extremely opaque, and it's not something that we often get a glimpse of. So I wanted to make a workshop that both explains sort of prison for somebody who has no idea of what prison is like, but then also to talk a little bit about the concepts of prison that operate in our society, both in the carceral system and in our day-to-day lives. So that's what this workshop is for. And I heard a couple things about what people are interested in learning about during this session. But feel free if there's something that needs to be clarified that you just raise your hand and or put something in the chat. So we had a really wonderful land acknowledgement this morning. Where I am situated is a territory of the Michi Saagig Nishnaabeg and the Haudenosaunee. And also, I want to recognize the countless millions of African, Caribbean, and Black people from across the earth that have been transported here. South Asians that have been transported here from the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. And it's important that we acknowledge how the prison system's architecture was rooted in both the Canadian colonial project and the incarceration of Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also in the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement and incarceration of peoples from around the world, Indigenous peoples from around the world. When I give these workshops, what I want to recognize is the legacy of prisoner justice movements that I describe in these workshops, and also my teachers incarcerated in our community or in our communities who are no longer with us. We have so many heroes in prisoner justice that rarely get mentioned in civic society, although they made immense changes in the world around us. And one of them especially is Peter Collins, who is a resistor who died in Bath prison, and his family fought to have his release on compassionate grounds because of his long struggle with cancer. And that was denied because of his activism in the prison system and the resistance that he offered. And so much of his resistance was one of love and companionship and fellowship of other prisoners and wanting prisoners to have affinity and healing, and how threatening that was to a system that wanted to, that promotes this notion of prisoners as unable to have restoration and needing long-term incarceration. So for all of our heroes of prisoner justice, for all of those people who never made it back from the prison system, we say miigwech and thank you for your efforts. So there's two systems of prison that operate in across Canada. There's the provincial system, which is everything from small town jails, detention centers, to what we now have in around Toronto, for example, is provincial super jails. So there's the one that's closest to me is Toronto East Detention Center. So many of the people that we work with in Trinity Square go to Toronto South Detention Center, and you may have heard of Lindsay Jail and others across Ottawa Carleton Detention Centers and others across the country. So the provincial jail system is for anybody who is serving a sentence of 2 years less a day. So relatively shorter term sentences, but also for the provincial jail system houses people who are on remand, where they have violated their parole or probation, but also detention orders for immigration, people who are awaiting trial, are being transferred to a federal institution. So it's a huge swath of the population. It's managed by the province, the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services. There has been a push recently to eliminate small town buckets, as they're called, or like, a couple rooms within a police station or small detention centers, and continue to build things like Toronto South Detention Center. And you may have seen this in the news. It's a multi-billion-dollar hellhole that's continuously expanding, and you can see the construction that's happening all around this. There's a book in the United States of how to build the architecture of small to large detention centers that has become the international handbook of how to build these spaces, and really was designed by a couple different prison building contractors in the United States. And you see the common architecture across all modern prison buildings. They end up looking like this. And this is a very unique type of construction because it's meant to be completely disorienting to people who enter into this space, so that they're never really able to understand where within the prison that they are, or what are the other parts of the prison and how are they operating. When you're in a space like Toronto South Detention Center, there's no direct sunlight. Sunlight is cascaded through fogged windows or through skylights, if you're lucky. But there's your skin for the entirety of your sentence never touches the sunlight. People often think about visiting prisoners in the way that we've seen them in Hollywood movies, like through the pane glass, and you put your face up to the glass in your hand and you kiss the person through the glass or whatever. Now, families who are visiting people in prison, this is what it looks like. All visits are done through Skype. Their family member is on the range. It's a large pod style range with about 30 to 40 other people on the range with them, and there's a video monitor with a telephone, and they have a limited amount of time where their family member can come into the reception area and then participate in a meeting through this telephone system. Alternately, there's the immense architecture of the kind of colonial building of the jail system in Ontario. This is Thunder Bay District Jail. When I look at this, what it's reminiscent of, and for us as Anglicans and Christian people, it highlights the similarity between residential school building, even up into like sort of, if you see like an older high school or education center, that colonial architecture remains. This is this jail, Thunder Bay District Jail, continues to hold about 80% population of Indigenous peoples, and it even has a room within it where hangings used to happen. People were hanged from one of the boiler pipes from the ceiling. And so, part of the thing that I try and recall and remember when I go and visit prisons is the history and legacy, the psychosphere that's happening over top of the place that that people are living within for periods of their life, and for some people in a repetitive pattern. The small sentences, and people say that they're doing life on installments. We'll talk about this in a moment, but the revolving door where people, especially in the provincial system, are within the prison for a year and a half. They get out on probation, are unable to comply with the terms of probation, or something else happens in their life, and they return back to prison for another short sentence. The complicated thing about these short sentences too is that every time you go into prison, you lose everything that you have. So if you're living in Toronto community housing, for example, you lose your Toronto community housing, you come out majoritively homeless. And we see a lot of people being released from court from the provincial jail system after 6 month to year and a half stays, where we have to work with them to rebuild every part of life. The light is shining through this window. Alternately, we have the federal penitentiary system, which is for people who are serving sentences of 2 years or more, and this is managed by the Correctional Services Canada, which is part of the federal government. There's 56 institutions across Canada. 51 of them are men's institutions, and 10 of those institutions are in Ontario. This is Millhaven Maximum. And so this jail was built in the 1960s and 70s in pieces, again, modeled after American style prisons, to create sort of a panopticon style prison where people are being observed through all of their movement. There's long hallways, and at the center of those hallways, there's a guard tower. And you see there's guard towers all around the perimeter of the building. I would go and visit this prison, visit people inside this prison. It's a maximum security prison now. It was very interesting because I had sort of like a counselor privilege. They would let me walk throughout the building, and it was so disorienting to try and figure out where I was going because every hallway looked the same. And there's a man there. In prison, you have you're mandated to have a job, whether it's you clean something, or you work in the kitchen, or you shovel snow, or you paint. And so there was this man who had done 20 years in Millhaven, and every time I would go, he would be painting the same hallway, and painting it like this institutional kind of hazy yellow color that we know from the 1970s. And it was one time I said to him, I was like, did you not paint this hallway before? And he was like, listen, this is a lot better job than a lot of other jobs here, so I'm going to keep painting these hallways. And so it was just it's just a bizarre, disorienting space to be in. This is also the place that used to be immigration detention. So for anybody who is convicted of in the 1990s, early 2000s, after NAFTA, breaching their immigration, or being in the country without documentation, or up into being convicted or accused of acts of terrorism, plotting terrorism. And somebody who I visited in this prison, Zachary Grant, who was falsely accused of being one of the sort of Canadian terror plot planners in that era after September 11th, was just released in this past week. So I want to celebrate him, but he spent over 17 years in this prison here. In contrast, this is Collins Bay Maximum Security Prison, and they call it Disneyland. Again, this idea of colonial architecture, that part of nation building was building this immense prison system. And when you go to Kingston, which houses so many of these prisons, you can go on tours of places like Kingston Bay Penitentiary and so on. It's become sort of a tourist attraction, and this campaign of how prisons are part of our responsibility as a nation state and a colonial state, and that they should be these dignified places, or presented as these dignified places. And the original concept of prison in Canada was to have places where more like a reform school or training school, and for us who studied, the impact on Indigenous communities as in colonization, know that trade school, training schools were a big part of the residential school sort of environment. And so likewise, this idea that nobility comes from learning and practicing a trade. There was these large kind of factory settings where people who are incarcerated could learn screen printing and print uh, letterpress setting and other kind of cabinetry skills like that, and then you get out with a trade to benefit your communities. So this was this era of people come here after committing a crime and are reformed. However, this building that looks like Disneyland, which used to hold all of the prisoners inside Collins Bay, is now only a facade to this giant maximum and super maximum special handling unit style prison. And most of this building is Corcan factories, so Corrections Canada factories. And it's so interesting when you go there because you'll immediately know that all of the furniture that has been made for government offices, all of that kind of pressboard wood, large conference table desks and things like that. Some of the things that I see even in our church buildings have been made in Corrections Canada factories by people who are making about $1.50 an hour to make these wares. This is Beaver Creek Medium and Minimum Security Prison, and this was built in the 1980s and 90s as part of a sort of a wave of prison reinvention. And there was an openness in liberal governments to make prison reform a priority and to make prisons more of a place of restoration and healing. There was a big movement for restorative justice and restorative process in the prison setting. And so they made prisons that were more open movement, independent. People would have a key to their room type cell that they had an obligation to lock themselves into at a certain time of day. And to make the prison environment more like an educational environment where people could go to classes, learn about themselves, take sort of counseling and therapy. During the Harper years, and many people may remember, there was a big push to close down all of the programs that were invented in this time as part of this healing movement, and move to the refinement of prison as sort of a very hard on crime, tough punishment style prison that was happening in the United States. This model, obviously, we've learned is incredibly profitable to a number of groups. Everyone from the food service and preparation industry, G4S, which is one of the main contractors for prisons across Canada, has lucrative multi-million-dollar contracts to serve the lowest quality food possible to the prison setting. That's one example, but there's countless others of groups like the people who do the cable, the telephones, the people who, down to the people who supply the fleet vehicles for the prison system that are, making millions and millions of dollars off of the long-term incarceration of people. But there's still these sort of remnant architectures. And so this is what the inside of Beaver Creek Medium, and it's a bizarre place. because it they had to find ways to make it a stricter place for prisoners, even within this architecture. So there's a digital surveillance system that's all around the campus, and essentially the guards from all across Canada who have been, part of complaints or lawsuits or so on, end up here because they're looking for folks who are going to be incredibly strict and punishing to people. In the center of this photo, you'll see that there's Inukjuks, many uh, Inuit who are uh, incarcerated in Arctic and Inuit territory, uh, who are serving a sentence of more than 2 years, end up in Beaver Creek Medium. It's very far from their families. Nobody could come and visit them. So in turn, they had this idea that they would build Inukshuk in the center here, which obviously means we were here, and it's sad to see Inuit in prisons in the South, because there is sort of a pan-Indian movement that happened in Corrections Canada, where people, there was a sort of a cultural wave of Native inmate liaison officers and the Native brotherhoods and sisterhoods that formed to support Indigenous people in their overrepresentation in prison. Um, I think the Canadian government assumed that Inuit would just mesh into these programs that are sort of cross cultural, but often they are the most isolated people in the prison system across Canada, and get ostracized by all of the groups because their culture is so different. This is Grand Valley Institution for Women. It was built to look like a suburb, and this is often one of the media showcases for when senators or ministers go to prisons. They go to Grand Valley. It was built during this era of prison reinvention, as like independent movement space. They've refurbished all of these units to have essentially metal door cells on the inside of all of these suburb units. So who goes to prison? People who have already been to prison go to prison. It's often a cycle that's very difficult to get out of. And once you go to prison, you have the experience of being dehumanized in the sense of people often end up with this joint attitude or sort of institutionalization of, they believe me to be a prisoner, I'm going to act like a prisoner, I'm going to go back to prison because I understand that environment, I've learned what that environment is, and that's how I'm going to operate in the world around me. It's very difficult to break, after being in prison for such a long time, to break out of the person you need to be in prison. We'll talk about that more shortly. There's a high prevalence of learning disabilities in prison, and also other cognitive disabilities. Everything from 50% of prisoners have a diagnosed head injury. Head injuries often impact people's reasoning ability to reason what is good and inappropriate action. Mercury poisoning, likewise, all of the communities that we support in trying to have clean water, the consequence of not having clean water is greater incarceration. Mercury poisoning, again, is very prevalent within the prison system because it impacts impulse control in the brain. There's a high rate of infectious diseases, 7 to 10 times higher rate of HIV, and 30 times higher rate of hepatitis C. When I was going to prisons, often people would be like, "Yeah, I'm hepatitis C positive. I got it from fighting," because people don't want to say that they're injection drug users, but a lot of people in prison are injection drug users or used injection drugs at some point in their life. There's a lot of TB in prisons as well, and I've seen in the news this resurgence of tuberculosis across the globe. But what we've known within the prison system for a long time is that marginalized communities across Canada, Turtle Island, have higher prevalences of tuberculosis. So every intake prison has a tuberculosis nurse. Many people who go to prisons, especially provincial prisons, are there because they've called the police in mental distress or emotional distress, and the response from police was to incarcerate them. Often they say that this is for their own safety, or the safety of family members. Maybe a family member calls the police to say, I can't deal with my son, daughter, child who has like deep depression or schizophrenia or another harder to relate to mental health disruption. And so the consequence from calling the police is that they end up in prison. Also, a lot of people end up in prison from methamphetamine overdoses. Contrary to opiate overdoses, methamphetamine overdoses is like, or other stimulant overdoses is, I need to get energy out of my body, which often looks and feels scary, threatening, so on to others. Really, people are trying to express that they're overdosing on a substance. The amount of people who enter prison or are in prison as sentenced people is incredibly low. It's about 15 to 20% of the population are actually sentenced in provincial prisons. The rest are awaiting trial. People sometimes await trial for up to 2 years, even longer than 2 years, while they're awaiting their court proceedings. So what's prison like? Well, there's long periods of lockdown. During COVID, this got even worse. There's a system called DRIP, which is 23-hour lockdown for people every day for the past 2 years, and sometimes for multiple days at a time, people will be locked down. This was to prevent the spread of COVID, or because guards were COVID positive or were taking time off during that period. And so, a lot of people really suffered during COVID within the prison system. And we saw a lot of folks trying to resist that and speak to the world around them about the conditions that were being made in the prison system. When I was going to federal prisons, the federal government had passed a bill to transform segregation, saying that segregation was unconstitutional. We worked with many people who had been in segregation for years, that they were never landed in general population, and who had entered into lawsuits and class actions to change that within the system. And so it was changed that there's no longer allowable segregation in the prison system. They've moved to structured intervention units, and it was super bizarre going to places like Warkworth Prison in Campbellford, Ontario, where they had a large segregation unit that people would be shipped to. The structured intervention units were the exact same part of the prison, only folks would be allowed out for a short period of time, and there would be like a regular check-in on them within the segregation unit. And they installed a freezer on the range, and they touted this as like a big success, that there was a freezer where people could order commissary food and have it stored in the freezer, but you could only access it 1 hour a day. People are shipped from institution to institution. People often are sentenced in Ontario, go to a federal prison in Ontario, and then end up in BC or Atlantic provinces away from their families. There's like and this is part of how we need to remember the transatlantic slave trade and residential school, the way that people are seen as disconnected from any human group, and that they're more of a commodity that is shipped from place to place without consequence. So people will be often serving lengthy sentences far away from their families. People are regularly psychologically assessed by psychometrists. Uh, and it's interesting because folks who know that they have mental health complications or histories of trauma, this is the first time that they're able to access a therapist or psychologist. Unfortunately for them, that therapist or psychologist is actually gauging what type of security threat they are to an institution. And so people often tell everything that's on their minds, and that to their own detriment, this false sense of safety that's created, not just with psychologists, but parole officers, probation officers, so on, that ends up harming them in the future. There's a whole host of common problems. One of the things that people often talk about is communication with the outside world is so difficult. And part of the way that people exit from federal prisons is to cascade down the security sort of system, that you start from a high or high medium security classification. And at the end, you end up in a low security institution or maybe you're doing day parole in the community or so on. There's maybe some different types of programming there. And you have an obligation to complete your correctional plan, which is determined by psychologists and parole officers and so on, all the courses you might have to take. And so, I see people who are like, I'm in here for like drug charges and I have to take a course on like anger management for the fourth time. People just kind of are shifted into, whatever courses that are available at any time. Or they need to take a course and it's not being offered for another 2 years. So they have to wait to finish this course before they're able to exit the system. So communicating with the outside world is difficult. To get into a halfway house as part of their cascade out of prison, often they need to write letters. There's no email, there's no cell phones, and you can only call a landline. And so we know how few and far between landlines are at this time. I believe over the past couple of years, this is beginning to shift and beginning to change. There was a push to have email system developed for prisoners so that they could communicate with the outside world, although there's also an equally large push to limit that communication for prisoners. How are we doing for time?
It's 11:06.
Okay, so I'm just going to surmise with the. Oh, I have a half hour. Okay, great. So how do we construct the prison archetype? I'm sure everybody has seen on television or on the internet a show that sort of is an inside look into what prisons are like. Lock Up Raw, 60 Days In. There's a couple channels, the cable channels that have made a total industry out of this. A&E is one of them, where almost half of their programming is about what it's like inside prison. A lot of these are American shows, and in America, it's rare to have a family that is not impacted by prison. And in fact, with several million people incarcerated across America, it's almost like something that's needed to have an expression of what the reality of American life is like, that it's so part and parcel of American families' experiences. And so these shows really demonstrate the most egregious parts of prison. That people are these savage warriors who need to fight for their survival within prison, or wheel and deal for their survival. And I think part of this too is people wanting to make meaning out of the experience of prison and going to prison. Maybe a male family member goes to prison, they become tough, rigid survivor of the prison system, and we lift that up. And especially in the Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities, that's an important thing, because of the mass incarceration of racialized people. There needs to be some kind of archetype that provides some sense of meaning. But for the rest of us, the way we look at prison through these shows is that people are uncontrollable, savage, unreformable folks who are, intent on uh, damaging the world around them or themselves or others. But in reality, from my experience, there is a lot of grief and loss in prison. It's ongoing, continuous loss that happens through the span of people's lives that culminate within the prison system. That 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 people have lived narratives of trauma and abuse that they then end up creating strategic coping mechanisms for, like withdrawal, depersonalization, aggression, so that they can survive their own psychic environment. And in a society where we provide little space and support for um, the trauma that people experience almost from birth, especially in marginalized communities, uh, this grief and loss ends up living within us and living within the prison system. Prison compounds trauma. 99% of the people that I counseled, and I counseled well over 150, 200 people within the prison system, uh, all disclosed to me an early life experience of primarily sexual violence, but often sexual and physical abuse, either from an intimate family member or someone close to them at an early age. And so folks live within this trauma for their entire lives, trying to balance between hyperarousal, disassociation, and that prison environment is such that it just enhances all of those feelings, and they're re-traumatized by that environment again and again and again, and all of those family dynamics or abuse dynamics are recreated within staff relationships, within guard relationships, with other prisoner relationships, and there's no outlet to deal with that trauma. Again, there's um, even the prisons with psychology departments. Those psychology departments are more integrally part of the security system than they are part of the healing system. And um, we've downgraded all of our interventions around restorative justice, transformative, and healing justice for folks. And so, what we're left with is prisons being a warehousing of undealt with trauma that we don't want in our society. It almost mirror the conditions that prisons enhance in people's lives are like a magnification of all of the things that they've experienced throughout their lives, living in communities that are broken, families that are broken, and no place to speak or deal with the hurt that they've undergone. So without an accessible shape for people to speak into, and live into healing around trauma, people take on a prisoner identity as a survival tool. And I'm talking about prisoner as in, like, I am here, strong enough to survive this experience. Nobody that I spoke to in the many years that I was visiting prisons is strong enough to experience or to survive the experience unharmed. And I talked to big grown men, tattooed faces, just jacked, who you'd think like nothing phases, who absolutely broke down at the opportunity to speak about what was inside them. And I remember when I was young in this work, going into Bath Prison and meeting with the lifers group. The lifers have like a special kind of meeting group where they get together and they talk about the prison conditions and like different things that are going on. And so I went there naively thinking that all of these folks want to rage against the machine and let's reignite prisoner justice and so on. And we were going around the circle, and all of these men were like sort of talking about what that meant for them. And it got to this guy who was like just had no neck, face tattoos, And he just took a breath and softly said, you know, I've been here a long time, and I appreciate what you're saying, but all of us here, we need to pull in our chests and push out our hearts to one another. And I was just so, all of the wind was sucked out of me in that moment. And it really reframed what it meant to be a prisoner, that it was not enduring um, so much systemic violence, but the violence that comes from being unable to have emotional worlds within us, being unable to have social loving worlds within us, and to have those forces oppressed, less our bodies, more of our spirits. So when we think about prisoners and this force of like anger and aggression, I like this graphic that behind this anger might be all of these other things that people don't have the ability or the emotional literacy to speak to directly. And a lot of the work that we were doing in prison was around emotional literacy and how do we have expressions of all of these other things. And for people who maybe were trained by a family member, that all of this needs to be put away. The only thing that you can show as a man or a woman survivor is anger. But what I learned is that prisoners really want to participate in their communities. They know that connection is the path to healing. And this is universal across everyone I spoke to, that they know that there is something deeply hurt within them and that there needs to be a path to healing, but they need to have they don't even have a roadmap for what that healing looks like, and no framework within their communities for healthy relationships and healing relationships. um, so there's a cohort of folks who are going into prison now that are 17, 18, 19 year olds from Greater Toronto area, mostly racialized Somali, Black, Caribbean, Native, and whereas this older generation of prisoners, people doing life, people, we kind of have the archetype in our mind. If you could draw a prisoner, this is what they would look like. Um, these folks maybe have, uh, you know, broken homes that they come from, but at least there was a home or a family unit. They might be coming from communities where industry is left and people didn't have jobs, but at least they had a sense of what the fabric of community looks like. This next generation of folks who are entering into prison, raised by foster care or grandparents in a community that never existed. And I think of all of the places where industry has just evacuated 30 years ago and nothing's happened since then. So these kids have no concept of what a downtown street in a community might look like. And I think back to when I was a kid of, living in a smaller, medium-sized city, and like the Christmas tree being lit in the town square, and people gathering around singing carols and things like that. Like there's not even that remnants of what community looks like for these folks. So what we're rebuilding together when we work with prisoners, especially young folks, is all of these experiences that help us to work together and to have safe support networks and places where emotions can travel physically, emotionally, and in a community setting. Nonetheless, even in these systems, prisoners are doing it for themselves. And Sheila, we were talking a little bit about disability in prison. So in the early 2000s, the John Howard Group got together with the lifers at Collins Bay, and the lifers there decided that they wanted to hold an event to honor the many people in the Kingston community that are living with physical, emotional, or developmental disabilities. And so they created this Special People's Olympiad. They're making $1.70 a day working at Cork, or $1.70 an hour working at Corcan. They saved up their money all year to make to have a barbecue and to have an Olympic style event where prisoners were paired up with a person from the community living with a disability to go through Olympic style events. And I just feel like this is the pinnacle of what prisoner justice looks like, the most humanizing experience that people have something to offer, that they want to offer it to the world around them, and the smiles that come from uh, hurt people working together to heal the world around us. It's very difficult for folks to transition back to the community, and I think that this is where people get interested in what can my church do, what can my group do to help people when they're released from prison. So much of it is about that there's no cascade of care when people come back to prison. They're literally released into the world, and you know we see on a daily basis people who get released from the courthouse in downtown Toronto and never leave the 4 block radius around that courthouse because the world beyond that is so daunting and scary. People who get out of prison who have never used a cell phone, for example. Imagine entering into our world after being incarcerated for 20 years, never having used technology. How would you find any of the services or support that you need, especially after COVID? I mean, there's very few things that you can walk through the front door in and receive help or support. Um, that's one of the places where we can really work. Churches are open. We're open on Sundays. Someone can walk in the door and be greeted. And so I think part of what our work is to create a space of welcoming for all people and to not be afraid of the person who walks through the door with the face tattoo and the big shoulders, because really what they're looking for is not it's not complicated. It's another heart to connect to. People really deal with that stigma of being an ex-prisoner, and we have impressions of what will be like for a person, or even for a person. For example, we have young people who come to church with ankle bracelets on, and the feeling of others who don't understand that is often complicated to deal with. Why do they have an ankle bracelet on? Are they going to steal something? Are they going to act aggressively, so on? No, they're here because they want to be a part of their community. We also need, as churches and as people of faith, to think about how do we put the intervention point further upstream. Decarceration means restoring communities and families and transforming our way of relating to each others and addressing hurt and harm. We think about the things that are possible through pastoral care and community care, and having spaces where community can come together as themselves without the pretense of, to be here, you need to be like us. And so having a space where people can come in their hurt or the harm that comes from living in an oppressive, marginalizing society is very important. It's something we can contribute to. And we need to talk about the warehousing of trauma. And we need to talk about prison as a warehousing of people, because there's nothing within the prison system that is healing. And this is something that as people of faith that we should reject, as Jesus rejected. How many stories from are from the gospel message are about Jesus releasing the prisoner, emptying the crypt, all of these things that are about the human spirit should not be contained. The earth spirit should not be contained. And yet we do this throughout our world. We also need to think about prison as not a place, but as a concept of society. And it's about making expendable classes of people. When I was happy to hear about Priscilla talk about, the consequences of extractive ideology, that a capitalist colonial construct is about gaining wealth and profit and resources over the collective well-being. And this is really the concept of prison. There's a marginalized class of society who takes up room. It's better for them to be warehoused, housed, so on, somewhere, so that they're off the land, they're not in resistance, they're not in defense of their communities, and we can do what we want. We can build a condo, we can build a diamond mine, we can flood the reserve. folks, a generation of folks will be in prison while we do this. And it's also about um, how we've constructed our society to have these pseudo prisons. You know, where we're situated, Trinity Square, all around us, there's a network of private security companies that police the para public space, the lobby and the area around the towers that people are moved out from in front of, especially houseless people and people without resources. There's no public space that is not in the downtown core that does not have a security unit, Garda, police presence, or you know, a diswelcoming, unaccessibilization movement happening. And it's really about you know, this landless class of people that we're creating through these actions that creates a revolving door between institution, street, and prison. You know, it's been magnified over COVID, the housing crisis that we found ourselves in. Uh, this is an intentional construction of the prison environment within our societies, that for a certain class of people with certain wealth and income and privilege, uh, that you are privileged to all things. And to make that happen, we need to move out all of the low income and houseless people, so that that they're not a disruption to your pleasure under capitalism. And so we see that by this the shrinking of public space and this revolving door of like street to prison, institution, shelter system. It's a divestment and an intentional divestment from people's well-being. But that being said, decarceration is happening all around us, and you know, over COVID, we've really seen an explosion of that. It just sort of springs up if you take away the things that are preventing it. We've seen young people support their communities in tents, in parks, in local neighborhood groups, in the indigenous community taking space and taking up cultural space within public space, which is treaty territory. If the world around us removes the obstacles, healing happens. It's amazing how it works. And as churches, we really do need elders and mentors who give permission to this transformation and support of the agents of change, and space for agents of change to live and to be present within their communities. So I will end it there, as I think that's a lot of information, and I want to make sure that there's time for people's questions. I see a couple things in the chat. So if anybody was interested.
Thank you so much, Zach. That has been, as you say, a lot of information, also a lot of inspiration. And I know that there is also a lot of experience in the room from people who have experiences that possibly parallel yours. So we'll invite folks to perhaps use the raise hand feature. And Zach, if you want to stop the screen share, that might make it easier for us to see each other. Perfect. Thank you.
Zach, thank you very much. You touched on an awful lot of things. To be perfectly honest, possibly too many. But it is such a huge problem. I represent an organization called Brampton Prison Ministry, which is the evolution of the Old Bridge Ministry. And one of our ambitions over the next 2 years is to put together a binders that can be sent out to churches, because as you say, one of our biggest problems, we have a very welcoming community here that understands what we face. in working with people who have been incarcerated. But most parishes have no idea, and as you say, are afraid of what they're getting into when they get involved in working with the previously incarcerated. So I hope that this is something that the diocese can work on, and we can move forward, where we teach people how to be a resource for the recently released. The Bridge learned that one of the biggest problems preventing the cycle of reincarceration was providing people with a month of support. And I don't mean financial, they can get financial, but actual, the kind of support that helps them find places to live, find the services that they need. Most of the people we dealt with who went back to prison, it was because it was almost just a reaction to the panic of their lives. And if someone had been there to hold their hand, a lot of them wouldn't have gone back. So thank you for all you've brought for us today. And I hope this is something that we can work towards.
Thanks, Mark. And you know, that's fantastic that y'all are working on that in Brampton. That's part of the challenge in this era is, you know, prisons are, you know, located across Canada, and in all of these communities, there are groups that want to help that people are released from those prisons and they are present in their communities, and there is a thrust to want to work on these issues now more than ever, and I'm happy for that. And the challenge is that we need to work together to connect all of our you know, small projects across the country, and see each other and learn from each other of what we're doing. And you should give me a call sometime soon, and we'll work together on that. I would love to hear more about what you're doing. Why don't we go
great.
Lori and then Michael, and there's a question in the chat as well.
Hi, thank you, Zach, and thank you for this morning. This has been awesome. I sit on the National Committee for Church Council on Justice and Corrections. I'm the Lutheran rep. Pam Dillon is the Anglican rep. She's out of Montreal, and right now we are really at a point where we don't know